session of How Do I Do X. We are really excited to have this session today with two new guests joining us. I'm guessing you guys must be tired of seeing just me and Vihar over here, but yeah. So as usually, we have come up with a couple of new things to talk about. Um, this week, it's gonna be prepared statements and async functions and JS promises, and how do you use them in your application. So what we've done is we collated all the questions that we got from our community, and here we are with some of the stuff that we want to show you guys. So introducing to this session, first of all, we have Trisha, and then we have Nidhi, who work as a platform engineer for us here at Appsmith. And if you have been following up with all the updates around Appsmith, you must have noticed that we recently released SAML and OIDC SSO enterprise features, and Trisha was the one who worked on that. So I'm really excited to have them. And yeah, here we go.
All
Hey,
right. Hey everyone. Let's wait for a couple of minutes for folks to join in, and then we can get started. Meanwhile, guys, you can tell us where you are joining from. I am joining from Chennai, and it's 10:30 p.m. here right now. Trisha and Nidhi.
hey, so I'm joining in from Bhopal and it is 100 degrees Celsius here.
Yeah, I trust you on that. In Pune, it's the same thing. I guess
Wait, what? I thought Pune and Bhopal were cooler. I can say that I'm joining in from Delhi and it's cooler than that. I'm really happy about Delhi right now.
Amazing.
All right. I think we can get started. Trisha, you can get started on the presentation.
Awesome. Let me just quickly share.
Folks, so in case if you have any questions, feel free to drop them on the chat. We'll be answering them at the end of the session. And also note that we'll be sharing this app post session so that you can play with this, on your own AppSmith, application. So you can simply fork them and play around with all these things. So yeah, over to you, Trisha.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vihar. So, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is smart substitution. So, this is a feature that we brought about for JSON bodies. This is something that we use in REST API post bodies with JSON content. There's something that we use in Mongo queries. And what we heard a lot from the users was how it's so hard to get the JSON to be correct. I just want to give a tiny demo. So I'm just going to copy paste the JSON body. So here I've just displayed the mustaches like this. But imagine if these are coming in from your input boxes, from your other APIs and other queries. And yeah, basically, had with smart substitution, you don't have to do things like adding a quote here. So if you see this evaluates to test string, and if I see string, you can see that the quotes got added automatically, even though you were missing a quote here. With number, you don't want it to be surrounded by quotes. And even though there are quotes here, the evaluated value will be 1, 2, 3. When it actually goes out, the number goes out as 1, 2, 3 as a number and not as a string. Similarly, for Boolean, this would be a string. And here you can see that the Boolean value went out as Boolean value. These were slightly hard problems because before smart substitution came out, everything would get evaluated as a string, and that's how it would get sent out. Another thing which is hard to do are actually used to be actually sending objects in JSON arrays, because you would have all the special characters, they would get escaped and they would not get sent as objects. So here you can see that the array got sent out as an array. JSON array got sent out as an array, an object got sent out as an array. One more scenario that we handled as part of this is when some path which evaluates to undefined, that used to get sent as string null, and now if you can see, this actually gets sent as a genuine null. Let me actually play around a little bit with this. So here is the body that I'm using. And here JSON Smart Substitution is turned on. This is found in the settings page. So here, I could remove quotes from here. I could add, like I can do anything. And, when I run this, uh, you can see, let me just scroll down, like the number is still 123, boolean is still false. There is this intelligent evaluation that we are doing to handle these special circumstances. Let me actually now turn off JSON Smart Substitution to show what happens. So here,
Trisha,
yeah,
sorry for the interruption. Can you just zoom in a bit?
okay.
Uh, yep. I think, can you like just zoom out? Yeah, I think this should do. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the body, and I've just gone in the settings and I turned off smart substitution. So I'm going to try running this again. The string is right now in an incorrect state because it's not surrounded by quotes. Number is correct. Boolean false, you expect it to evaluate to false, but I think we're going to start seeing errors. So, like, as you can see, JSON parsing just failed. And for me to actually fix this, I'm gonna, add quotes here. I'm gonna let the number P. I'll have to add quotes here. There wasn't a way for us to send a Boolean value as Boolean value. Uh, I have a feeling I wouldn't be able to fix this at runtime, but yeah, basically some of these are easier now by just turning on smart substitution, that after evaluation we fix the values for you so that you can use smart substitution and not have to deal with the nitty gritties of fixing your JSON with different user inputs. So here the mustaches are supposed to represent the different user inputs. And when the input changes, you don't have to create a different action to handle that specific kind of input. We'll do this automatically. Just go to settings and turn on smart substitution.
Hey Trisha, quick question. Is there any difference in the way that we do substitution for Mongo as opposed to REST API?
There's a slight bit of difference because Mongo expects it to be in Bson format. It's a very MongoDB defined thing, which is very similar to JSON but slightly different. So your experience should remain the same, but on the implementation side, it is slightly different to handle the difference between JSON and Bson. Just that. Awesome. So let me come back to the next one. If there are no questions around smart substitution, I'll come next to prepared statements. Now, prepared statements is something that we introduced for all of our SQL plugins, because prepared statements is something that has existed in the software world for a long time. And the most important reason why we came out with prepared statements was to protect our the applications developed on Appsmith from SQL injection. That's one of the biggest reasons that we came out with prepared statements, so that the burden of sanitizing your user inputs is not on the developers building apps on Appsmith, but we would do it out of the box for you. So let me just go ahead and show you. So just have like a very simple select star query where you're passing a parameter in where clause. So you're doing select star from users where ID is less than, and then you have a user input. Now, because like here it's a static value 10, but here is where you can put input one dot text, and you are protected from the user input, because whatever the user inputs, that would be treated as a parameter and it would be sanitized before it's executed. So here is a simple select star where we are expecting you to pass the parameters for the query as a mustache binding. Um, if I just quickly show you where the setting lies. So here, right below the text box where you enter your query, you have the use prepared statements. Just turn it on from here and you will automatically be protected from SQL injection. So now what happens here is that we usually, when prepared statements are configured, you're supposed to give the data type for each parameter. We are doing that automatically for you. But there are certain scenarios where the automatically what data type we've selected does not really match the column type. So for example, if you look at this table, the latitude looks like a floating number, but in our table it's actually configured to be a text. So if you were to do, let me quickly show you, if you were to do select star from users where longitude is just this, without the typecasting, this was going to fail. Uh, Let me again show this. So let me remove this. And this is a user input. I'll quickly run this. And here you can start seeing that the type that we magically set here did not match the type for the column longitude. So to fix that, we also give you an option for you to explicitly cast that data type to ensure that there is no confusion. And once I run this like this, it's gonna run. All right. Now, I want to talk about a scenario where what you're trying to do is basically doing a dynamic query generation. So here, there's a question that we've gotten a lot from the users, which is basically you want to do select star from users, then you have a condition. If the condition evaluates to true, you want to add a where clause. Otherwise, you just want select star from users. Now, what this is a dynamic query being generated. Instead of just passing a parameter where 10 would have been the parameter the way I showed you in simple prepared statements, you're actually trying to generate the query by saying where add a where clause in case something evaluates to this. So this is something that prepared statement does not support. You cannot generate a query on the fly. So if I quickly come here, in this case, you get a syntax error. Here, I will turn off the prepared statement because this is query dynamic query, and then I run it. Oops. Okay. Yeah. So let me actually turn on the prepared statement with the fixed query and just show it to you that if you're trying to substitute an entire where clause, it's not going to work. But if I turn it off, this is going to work just fine. You can also false. No. So this is one scenario where prepared statement does not work. I also want to show you another scenario where prepared statement does not work, which is basically you choosing your table name here. So here users is coming as a runtime parameter and not as a static thing. Again, this is something that does not work with prepared statements. So I'm just going to go. So I'm just going to turn off prepared statement here and I'm going to run this and you can see that it works. So basically, this is a valid parameter that can be used to sanitize user inputs using prepared statements. But if you want to dynamically select your table name, this does not fall under the purview of prepared statements and you would have to turn off prepared statement for this. All right. The next thing that I want to talk about is how do you do in clause? So with prepared statements. So a way to write this in a non-prepared statement world would be select star from users where ID in, and then you pass on the values from which it needs to select. Unfortunately, prepared statement, it's not possible for you to do uh, variable length in. So here your array length can be any length and that will be supported. But let me actually show you a static in clause. So if you are aware of how many options exist in your in clause, then go ahead and use it like this, where basically for every entry you have a mustache binding. Then you can use select star from where status in. But in case you're sending an array whose length is not predefined in prepared statements, you should use equal to any, and this will ensure that your query runs while the input is being sanitized. I just want to talk about the fact that this equal to any is supported on Postgres, but on MySQL this is not supported. So if you have a dynamic length array here, you will have to use this without prepared statements if you're running this on MySQL. This is your only way of doing this. Yeah. Uh, these were the questions that I saw and prepared for. Is there any use case that I've missed out on? Vihar, Pranav, Nidhi?
Nothing that immediately comes to mind, but do you think that we can maybe have a set of guidelines for folks to think about when prepare statements should be something that is turned on and when it is not?
Right. So basically, whenever you have conditions which you have in your select or in your update, you are taking in inputs to update a certain field. Whenever it's the data which is what you're referencing and it is being inputted using user inputs, that's definitely when you should be using prepared statements so that you're safe from SQL injection. But we do realize that you want to do different, instead of creating 10 different queries, you want one single query to be dynamically generated, like for example this one, where you want to on the fly add a where clause if some condition becomes true or false. And for those scenarios you will have to turn off prepared statements.
Um, yes. Trisha, I have one question. So, let's say you mentioned that dynamic query is something when you have parts of query that are being generated dynamically, right?
Yes, yes,
So, does that include column names as well?
yes. I'm sorry it's not here, but
Okay.
yes, it also includes column name, table name, column names. These should be
Okay.
static if you want to use prepared statement.
All right. Makes
Yeah.
sense. All right. If there are no more questions, we can get started with the other.
Awesome. So I'll hand off to Nidhi for covering promises and chaining in JavaScript. Very exciting topic and lots of questions.
Yeah. So most of the queries that we've seen around using the JS objects or JavaScript in general in Appsmith have been around figuring out how to make sure that the way that your queries are getting executed is predictable, or like how do we figure out how to sequence them or at what point they'll be executed. So we've collected a bunch of questions in the demo around this. Let's start out by trying to understand what sort of references are valid in different parts of AppSmith. So this gets qualified into two aspects. One is data and the other is events, right? So anywhere on the Appsmith application that you need to be showing data from your queries, you'd be referencing your query directly as API1.data or query1.data, or if it's a JS object, you can call that JS object as JS object 1.func1 as a function, if that JS object happens to be a synchronous one. Um, on the other hand, if you want your queries to be running as a response to some event that your user has done, for example, a button click or selecting a row on the table, at that point of time, you don't want to be accessing the data from the query. So you wouldn't access it as query1.data. It would be, you'd want to be triggering an action. So that would be query1.run. Um, so over here in this example, when we loaded the page, we have set up the reference for the table. Trisha, if you can go to the edit mode. The table is actually using API1.data, which means that it is expecting the data to be there already, and we're displaying the data. This results in API1 running immediately on page load, because Appsmith realizes that this information is something that the application requires as soon as the page is loaded. And that's how the data is refreshed. Um, if you take a look at the input widgets on the side, now those input widgets have um, a reference to the table data, right? So as soon as I do any kind of selection on the table, I would expect that these input widgets would now start to show my data. Now that is how Appsmith handles reactivity, in the sense that without any, just by virtue of connecting the input widgets to the data inside of my table rows, every single time that I click on a new selected row on the table, the data that is shown in the input widget will keep updating. That again is reactive nature. The second aspect for this is we have a button on the top which says show file users. This is the one that uses an event, which is on clicking this button, I need some trigger to happen, which is I need my action to get run, which is API1. Over here in this case, I'm calling API1 with a parameter of limit 5. Now, if we go ahead and click on that button, this will make API1 run, but because we had connected table to API1.data, table will again realize that, now that API1.data has refreshed, its own data gets refreshed, and then that again will correspondingly change the input data as soon as you select a row on table. So all of this just happens because of the reactive nature that we've set up. So with this context in place, we want to be now diving into how the different kinds of JavaScript functionalities we start to introduce inside the JS object will start to reflect on our apps as well. So one of the use cases that we've seen for JS objects is that we want a lot of logic to happen on page load before any of the users have done any action on the page itself. Um, how do we make sure that that happens before interaction happens, right? So one of the examples for that is using the Appsmith Store. Um, the Appsmith Store is a a local browser cache that we have available that we expose as a function called store value. Now, this function is asynchronous in nature. Now, what's the difference between synchronous and asynchronous, right? So, all of the functions that we expect to just run in sequence as soon as it is triggered, and not like it meant any synchronous function that you have will maintain the flow of data, um, and not for all of the synchronous functions we'll expect that only after the entire function has executed will the next line be executed. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum is an asynchronous function. For async functions, the premise is basically that you trigger the function, and then when that function actually gets executed and completed is not something that we're going to wait around for. The code would basically move on. Um, Store value is one such function. When you call store value, you're basically trying to access the Appsmith store and store one of your variables in there. And as soon as you call that function, what you're basically saying is that please go and store that new value of mine into the Appsmith store. But that does not necessarily wait around for that value to get stored into the Appsmith store before you move on with your code. Hence, the concept of this async await function that we have right here. If you see over here in line number 1 in the function, we say await store value, and that keyword over there where we say await is what is going to make this entire function not move ahead from that line and store value till the point that the store value actually executes. Um, as soon as we start to use a keyword like await, this entire function would now become asynchronous, which means we would expect this entire function to be something that we can only use as an event in events. This is going back to the concept that we discussed earlier, the difference between data and events in Appsmith. You cannot use asynchronous functions in the data options.
Nidhi, just to touch upon one of the questions that our community has been raising. So this directly corresponds to the async function called in sync field error that users have been saying, right? Can you elaborate that?
Correct. So that error message is meant to indicate that the usage of these functions has been done incorrectly, in the sense that when we say that table data will only ever allow synchronous functions or functions which will be executed in order and will be predictably ending at as soon as the evaluation ends. Those are the only types of functions we're allowed to use for table data, because otherwise, the how do you know when table data will eventually get the correct value? To make sure that we know for sure that as soon as the table loads, it's going to have the correct value, we're only allowed to use synchronous functions over there. The error message that says you've used an async function in a sync field is indicating that this particular field, the table data, expected you to use a synchronous function, but you have at some point referenced an async function, and that is not something that Appsmith allows.
All right. And this is not just limited to a table data field. Everywhere there is a data field, this logic applies, right?
That's absolutely correct. Yes. So, in general, the rule to think about for this is that any validation, any visible data, anything that is basically trying to determine how your data is going to be represented in your application. So, all of these fields in the general section of the input widget, for example, they are all meant to have synchronous data
Okay.
because they're all meant to be calculated beforehand.
Thanks for that.
I guess I'll add a little bit here is that these actions, you're going to see this in all property panes for widgets. Wherever it's actions, those will be the places where you can add asynchronous functions. So these on text change, you can call asynchronous functions at this place.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Right, let's go back to that function. Right, so just really quickly walking through this function, we're doing a store in the, we're storing the value in our Appsmith store with an undefined, which is basically a reset. we're trying to see at what point what the value was at that point. There is the before show alert, and then we're storing another value after that, and then we're trying to see if the value got updated. Now, because we've done await at every single point over here, this should all execute in order, and we expect to see, if you just go ahead and run, Trisha, let's just, so we see here that before x was undefined, and after we stored the value, it became val1 as the code shows. So for like this example basically shows how to introduce predictability when using asynchronous functions like store value, right? Now let's move on to another example where uh, the in this async await method of doing this using the store value can also be replaced by another way of accessing data, and that is basically by doing function chaining. This is something that you might have actually seen in API calls and API. As soon as you do use promises, which is what our API responses actually are. So as soon as the reference over here, fetch movies, is actually a query, right? Now, fetch movies dot run is how we are triggering a query call, and whatever we expect the response of this dot run to be is going to be a promise. Now, for us to be able to say what happens at the end of this call, option A was the async await, which we'll come back to. But option 2 over here is that we start to chain the response from uh, fetch movies, which is the promise. From that promise, we say that the response that we receive is then captured in the dot then handler, and with the response, we've gone ahead and done a show alert to see if we've actually received the length of the response that we expected and returned that response. We also have the corresponding dot catch handler, which is what will get triggered in case any error happens in during the run for fetch movies. So if we run this function, for example, we should see the successful execution. Yeah, there we go. So we should have 10 rows here. You will notice that in here, we haven't actually pre-annotated this function with the async keyword, and that was not required because when we return from a function with a promise, we automatically understand that this function is asynchronous. We don't have to specify that in the function definition, and adding the keyword works as well. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not required in this way of handling promises. On the other hand, if we go to the async await example, you'll see that over here the async keyword is there. It's right besides the name of the function there. Yeah, and this this kind of definition will fail if you don't use the async keyword, and so this is like a required thing. In this, so this example is actually exactly the same as the previous one. We've done exactly the same thing here, which is to call fetch movies, except that in this case we are not using the dot then handler. We're awaiting the result for the run call, and we're storing that response in a data. Now, what this means is that after the await call, the data keyword is not going to be a promise. It's going to be the actual response object that we saw in the dot then call. Yeah, and then as soon as we get the response data back, that object back, we can just proceed with the rest of our code with whatever processing we want to do. The advantage of this kind of coding being that we don't have to, we're not like going to have a lot of nesting in terms of the handlers that we use.
Yeah. Basically, the callback hell that we
Yeah.
like to call it. Yeah.
You will notice though that we have like an extra try catch block that we've added to this function, which was not there in the chaining way of doing things, because the dot catch back there was handling our error scenarios. But in this case, for error scenarios, we basically do it in the same way as we do for normal like errors in our synchronous logic.
Um, Nidhi, just one question. So, is there a scenario wherein you would recommend using async await or chaining? Like, I understand that data manipulation is one, but is there a bigger application of this that you can think of?
Um, so data manipulation, yes, but whenever you have a lot of logic dependent on, say, multiple API calls, different data sources, you basically want to bring a lot of data from your backend servers into Appsmith, and then you want to start processing all of that information. That is where you would want to start think about async functions, where you run a lot of queries successively. You can even run them all together and wait for all of them to complete at the same time. That's how you do promises.all, right? And then at the end of all of those calls is where you'll then sit and think about what you want to be doing with the result of each of these queries. That's one example. Another one could be depending on user inputs. If you want to be running like different kinds of queries and you want to make sure that the flow for each of these is determined on the fly depending on what the user is inputting. So as one was like different kinds of data sources, the other is different kinds of user inputs. Whenever you want to introduce any of that kind of logic and run queries on the basis of that, and not just like run queries beforehand and then use the data, that's like a perfect use case for async.
Okay. So, along those same lines, I could also think of a very interesting use case wherein you can have two different queries running from two different data sources, and you can join them like a SQL join based on a property that is sort of uh, like common to both of them, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's nice.
Awesome. There's actually one other use case right at the end of this list, which is calling APIs in a loop. This one again is using the async await as well as the promise handler way of dealing with API calls. But the difference here is that so Pranav, this is one of the examples for like a more complicated use case of when you'd want to be using async functions. Over here, what we've done is that again in the from the fetch movies query that we ran in the previous example, we're going ahead from over there. So in the previous example, what we basically did was to run the query and return the response after printing our logs. Over here, what we're doing is that with that query run that we had, for the response, we want to be using that response, figuring out like some amount of information from that response, and then on the basis of the response, I want to be running a few other queries. So if we walk through this code right here, what we're doing is we're running fetch movies. From the response that we receive as a result of that query, we're just looping through each of the movies that we expect to get in the response. And for each of the movie identifier, we're storing that in current ID. For each of the movie identifier, we're going to be running queries again for that specific movie to get a response for that particular movie. And in that way, we're just like using the response from the previous query and then running another new one. Yeah. I think I've seen a bunch of queries around looping. This is an example of that. So in the run for this, you'll see that there's like a bunch of new calls with different IDs. So these are all the different IDs we received as a response from the first query. Yeah. Right. Do
Yeah.
you want to be talking about on-page load examples, Pranav?
Yes, I will. Just a sec. Let me share my screen. All right. So, yes, in like last couple of releases, you might have seen Appsmith come up with a very nice little feature wherein you can actually run a JS function on page load. So there are, as Trisha and Nidhi demonstrated various use cases of how you can mix and match your queries and your JS functions to get the result that you want. You can write business logic that could run on page load, and then you can figure out, hey, do I want to show particular data to this user or not, right? And what that means is you are making decisions on the fly when the page load. So in earlier versions of Appsmith, you could only run queries on page load. But now we have added a feature wherein there is a settings tab over here. Let me just zoom in a bit more. Yeah, so settings tab right next to the editor, which tells you how many functions you have. There is just one in my case, and then you can set it to page load or not. And similarly, you can also set it whether you want to confirm the running of that function or not. So let's just take a look at the use case that we have for this particular application. So my requirement over here is uh, whichever user that logs into this particular
Pranav, can
application.
you just zoom in a bit?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, can you see it?
Yeah, this looks good. Thanks.
Okay. So the requirement over here is if the user is from Appsmith, I want to show them the administrative data, right? But if user is logged in but not from Appsmith, I want to show them limited data. But if user is anonymous, I don't want to show them any sort of data, right? So now, how do we do this using all the concepts like async await or JS promises, and with the prepared statements that Trisha just demonstrated? We'll take a look at the data loader JS object, and I have a small little function over there which is going to fetch the data. So right off the bat, you'll notice that the function is asynchronous. And what that means is this will be triggered by some action, right? And the action here is on page load. So we have set that from there. So this function is going to run on page load. So now here I'm checking if user is anonymous. Basically, Appsmith provides a context object with user property, and you can do is anonymous to figure out if the user is anonymous or they are logged in user. So once you determine that, what I want to do personally is not show them any sort of data, right? So there is no point in running our query which will fetch the data. It's just waste of time. So what I'm going to do next is basically navigate them to a different page. This is something you can think of like a 404 page which shows up on your web app. And so on this particular page, I just tell the user, hey, you are not authorized and please log in, right, to see the data. But the interesting case here is, if we go to loader again, what happens after that if clause? So you figure out what is the domain name of that user's email address, right? We want to figure out if they are from Appsmith or not. So what I'm trying to do here is I'll split the email that I got for that user, and I'll check if the domain is appsmith.com. So now if the domain is appsmith.com, I have a fetch users query that is going to run. But as you can see, there is really little difference between both the cases if the user is logged in. What I'm trying to do over here is use the same query, just that pass different columns from here itself, right? So let's talk about these levels after, but before that, we'll go to this query. And now, as Trisha mentioned, this query is being prepared on the fly. This is not a static query. So the column names will come in as a parameter to this query, right? And that's why we have kept the prepared statements off over here. And keeping that in mind, if we go over here now, our only responsibility is to pass the list of columns that we want each of these users to see. So remember, if the user is Appsmith user, we show them the whole data. But if the user is logged in, we want to show them limited data, right? So in the first case, if user is appsmith.com, we pass the level 1 columns, which is ID, name, gender, date of birth, everything, like a private details that a user might have and an admin might need, right? But on the other hand, where you want to limit access to your application and access to your data, what you can do is simply pass these two columns, and these column names could be completely different in your use case. But when we run this page, so what is going to happen is on page load, the data got triggered. I'm sorry about this. Yeah, so function got triggered. I think I've misplaced something over there, but oops, sorry. Yeah, so this happened. I'll go to page one again. I'll refresh the page. Yes. So in this particular case, as you saw, the data comes in like with the level 1 uh, authority, because my email address is pranav@appsmith.com, right? But now what happens if we take um, the let's go to current deployed version, and this is again, so there is a problem with the deployed version, but let's forget about that. I'm gonna take you to an incognito window. I'll share my other window, just a sec. It's incognito. Yes. So now when we visit this particular URL, and you'll see that we've landed on a page which is sort of a 404 page for our application, because this user is not logged in. And if I had logged in with some other email address, barring appsmith.coms, it would have taken me to a page which shows limited data and doesn't show the whole admin page itself. Right. So you just saw a problem that I fixed it quickly, and cheekily I might say. So I'll reproduce that problem again. So what happened over here, right? I came here and I ran this. So when you are running your JS function with a query there, and that query is gonna run on page load, right? But in some cases, users could forget that this toggle over here is on, and what that means is this query is gonna run on page load by itself, and the function is also gonna run this query, right? So now there are two contradicting requests that are going out to AppSmith. So just be mindful, if you want this query to run on page load and if you are calling it from an asynchronous function, please keep this on page load thing off, so that the query runs only once and you get the result that you need. So yes, that's me just fencing before somebody calls that out, but
No, but that's a pretty interesting use case because, and something to look out for all the time, because we would expect that query to be actually marked as to be run on page load,
yes,
because that reference exists in the table widget.
yes.
So that's, I mean, really, really nice that it got pointed out in your example.
If you have any questions, like we'll take it now. And all these applications that we've shown you, these will be available in the comments section. I guess Vihar will be making them public. And again, if you have any questions around these, we will have a nice descriptive post on our discourse on our Discord that goes out like after this session. That will explain the whole thing again in a text format if you are bored listening to us. So uh, I guess that works out fine as well. Okay. Wow, the comment section is super quiet today. I feel that's a Trisha and Nidhi effect, because I and Vihar always get questions. You no, I'm congratulating you. Like this is This has been a nice experience.
All right, but I think Arpit has a cool idea. He just posted that on chat. I'm gonna put it on the screen. Probably Trisha, would you like to elaborate on this? It would be great if Appsmith automatically detect if the query failed because of prepared statements or just an invalid query. Would be useful for me to debug query failures. So any comment on this?
A very, very valid use case. Uh, but unfortunately, that doesn't exist today, and something that we should take into account, because even when I was giving the demo, you could see that it was showing up as a syntax error uh, in the scenarios where you were dynamically generating the query, by which either you were trying to use table name as a you were trying to input table name as a parameter, or you were trying to add a where clause on the basis of some condition, which is dynamic query generation, and it just showed up as a syntax error. And it's not very clear that this is happening because prepared statements is turned on. Yeah, I do think it would be very, very useful for developers. Yeah, let's take this down as a feature request.
Awesome, awesome. So we also have one more question from Kasun, but I think Confidence had already answered that. I'm just gonna put that on the screen. Does AppSmith support importing an open API definition as a kind of a data source?
I'll take that. So we already have a feature request on our radar regarding this. So yeah, it will come up shortly, I guess, when we plan it out. But if you are interested, I'm just gonna put the link in the chat over here. You can please go upload this feature request, and we'll be happy to hear what your use cases and how you're planning to use it. It will be also helpful for us to prioritize the feature when we get to it. So
I have a small question for you, Pranav. I haven't used OpenAPI, but do they not? Since we support curl for today to get the user unblocked, is there no alternative curl right now?
um, I'm not sure at this point, but I can figure out and post it on the chat.
All right. So Kasun, he asked if there's a Discord channel. Yes, we have an awesome Discord channel with awesome community. So you should definitely be in there, or you're gonna miss a lot of cool things. Uh, uh, I think Pranav had already posted the link where you can join in. Alternatively, you can also visit appsmith.com/community. We are active on multiple places, so uh, you'll get all the updates there. Or in case if you have any questions, feel free to post them there. All right. So, folks, we'll be ending the session in a couple of minutes. In case if you have any questions regarding this session or any questions in general regarding the platform, do post them here. Or else we will be always there for you to help you on our intercom, on our community website, and also on our discourse.
By the way, I'd like to share my screen and show you guys a couple more resources. So if you are ever stuck, this documentation that we have on docs.absolute.com is being improved every day. But with that, we also have a list of sample applications, small applications like you saw today, to tackle like smaller queries. How do you use async await, and how do you use chaining or callbacks and stuff like that? How you do you validate your forms regarding charts and whatnot? So please take a look at this. This must be like this will be really helpful for you. This count is right now at 70, but it's gonna cross 100 really, really soon. Also, the second um, place where you might find really good value is our forum. Here, you can see posts marked with "How do I do X?" Vihar regularly posts over here, and if you just search through this tab, you'll see a lot of questions, like at least 60 to 70 questions that you can search through over here as well. So if you are a newbie and you don't know how to do certain things, please visit both of these resources. And yeah, this will be really helpful in developing all the knowledge that you need to build like better applications on Appsmith. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Pranav. This is so useful. Also, Trisha, do you want to make that announcement for the self-hosted instances?
Oh, um,
The
we went
enterprise.
live with, yeah, we went live a month ago with our first enterprise edition. And yeah, today SSO is out. You can configure SSO using OIDC and SAML both on enterprise. And we are working very hard towards bringing granular access control and audit logs very, very soon.
Awesome, awesome. Not just that, folks. Our 17.0 release is already out. So we have the theming feature now available on the Appsmith apps. So we are gonna discuss more about it in our next session. So Conference will be doing our release jam next one. So be sure to be there. We'll be doing some cool demos on how you can make your Appsmith apps more beautiful. So stay tuned for it. All right. Thank you all, folks, for joining in. We'll wrap this session, uh, and we'll see you back in the next one.
Cheers, guys. See you.
Cheers.